I lay there paralyzed on the cold glass floor of a Manhattan penthouse, while the distant sounds of city traffic hummed beneath my motionless body as if nothing had happened. My name is Jocelyn, and I am 27 years old, a woman whose life changed forever the moment my lower half went completely numb during a high-stakes family celebration. My sister stood over me with a mocking smirk while she watched me struggle for air on the hard surface because she believed her cruel prank was the highlight of her birthday. My father looked down with pure irritation before yelling that I needed to walk it off and stop being a baby instead of helping me up. My mother stared at me with cold eyes while she accused me of ruining the most important night of the year just to get some attention for myself. They had absolutely no idea that their heartless dismissal of my physical agony would soon turn them into criminals in the eyes of the law. Before we dive deeper into the betrayal that shattered my world, I want to know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that no one should ever have their suffering ignored by the people who are supposed to protect them, please hit that like button and subscribe to stay tuned for a story about the day my family's cruelty finally crossed a line they could never come back from. Growing up in our household felt like participating in a never-ending stage play where everyone had a script except for me. My father, a high-profile real estate lawyer named Bennett, believed that any display of physical or emotional pain was a direct insult to his carefully curated reputation. My mother, Madeline, managed a prominent charitable foundation, and she was far more concerned with social standing than the actual well-being of her youngest daughter. From a very young age, I realized that my sister Cassandra was the undisputed star of their world, while I was merely a supporting character meant to highlight her brilliance. Whenever Cassandra targeted me with increasingly dangerous antics, my parents would simply sigh and tell me that I was being far too sensitive or imagining things just to cause drama. I still remember when Cassandra pushed me down a flight of stairs during a summer gala because she decided my dress looked better on her. When I sat at the bottom, clutching a swollen ankle, Dad looked at his watch and told me to quit being dramatic because his partners were watching. Mom didn't even check for a bruise, but instead lectured me about how my clumsy behavior was embarrassing the family in front of important donors. This toxic dynamic became the foundation of my life as I learned to hide my injuries just to avoid being labeled as the problematic child. Cassandra realized very early on that she could inflict harm on me without ever facing a single consequence from our parents. She developed a habit of using my real name with a sharp, condescending tone that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. While Cassandra was sent to the finest schools, I was left to navigate my own path with minimal support or acknowledgement. I worked twice as hard to build a career as a freelance graphic designer, just so I could have the financial means to escape their influence. My success was never celebrated at our dinner table because it didn't involve a prestigious law firm or a high-fashion runway. Even as an adult, the mere sound of my sister's voice would trigger a surge of anxiety because I knew another humiliating prank was always lurking around the corner. I spent years in therapy trying to unlearn the belief that my pain didn't matter, and that my voice was worth less than the silence my parents demanded. Yet despite the distance, the invisible threads of family obligation kept pulling me back for every milestone and holiday. I convinced myself that if I just played my part well enough, maybe one day they would see me as a person rather than an inconvenience. I had no way of knowing that my willingness to endure their cruelty would eventually lead me to the brink of a permanent physical catastrophe. 48 hours before the nightmare began, I was sitting in my quiet studio in Boston, finalizing a major contract that would have secured my independence. The notification on my phone shattered my peace, as Madeline's name flashed with a persistence that usually signaled a looming family command. She didn't ask how I was doing, but immediately launched into a description of the extravagant 31st birthday party they were throwing for Cassandra. My mother insisted that my presence was mandatory because the event was being held at their new multi-million-dollar penthouse, and they needed a perfect family portrait. I tried to explain that I had a crucial deadline for a client who was paying me more than I had earned in the previous 6 months. Dad took the phone, and his voice was like shards of ice as he told me that my little projects were insignificant compared to the networking he had planned. He reminded me of the private school tuition he had paid a decade ago, as if that gave him lifetime ownership over my schedule. My stomach churned at the thought of being a prop in their hollow display of wealth, but the fear of a permanent rift still held power. I finally agreed to take the train to New York, promising myself that I would leave the moment the photos were finished and the toasts over. I spent the next day in a state of dread, my intuition screaming that something was wrong with the atmosphere surrounding this particular celebration. Cassandra had been uncharacteristically quiet during the group text threads, which was usually a sign that she was plotting something particularly malicious. I packed a simple black dress that I hoped would allow me to blend into the shadows without drawing any of my sister's unwanted attention. As I boarded the train, I reached out to my friend Kendra, who had been my anchor through the storms of my upbringing. I told her that I felt like I was walking into a trap, but she tried to reassure me that it was just my past trauma manifesting as paranoia. We joked about me being back in Boston by Sunday morning to celebrate my new contract with a brunch that didn't involve any judging glares. I wanted to believe she was right, but the heavy weight in my chest only intensified as the Manhattan skyline came into view. The city felt colder than usual, and the towering glass buildings seemed to mock my vulnerability as I hailed a taxi to the Upper West Side. I checked into a small hotel nearby because I refused to stay in the penthouse, where I knew I wouldn't be able to lock my door. My parents had already sent 3 messages demanding to know my location and criticizing the fact that I wasn't already helping with floral arrangements. I ignored them and focused on my breathing, trying to build a mental wall that would protect me from the emotional barbs. I stepped into the elevator of the penthouse building at 6:30, feeling like a soldier heading toward a battlefield without armor. 7 o'clock sharp marked the moment I stepped out of the elevator and into a world of blinding chandeliers and the clinking of crystal glasses. The penthouse was a monument to excess, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Central Park most people only see in movies. Cassandra was already at the center of a large circle, her laughter ringing out like a sharp bell as she basked in the worship of her peers. When she spotted me, she didn't offer a hug, but scanned my outfit with a look of disgust before commenting that black was a depressing choice. Madeline rushed over not to greet me but to adjust my hair and tell me that I looked pale and should have tanned before showing my face. Bennett was standing near the grand piano talking to men in bespoke suits, and he barely acknowledged my arrival with a curt nod before returning to his conversation. I felt the familiar sting of invisibility as I retreated toward the bar, ordering a sparkling water because I knew I needed every ounce of awareness. It was there that I met a man named Julian, who introduced himself as an orthopedic surgeon and a colleague of one of my father's friends. He was the first person all evening who actually looked me in the eyes and asked a genuine question about my work without bragging about himself. We spoke for 20 minutes, and for a brief moment I felt like a human being rather than a family disappointment. However, the peace was shattered when Jocelyn approached with a predatory glint, clearly annoyed that I was receiving positive attention from an eligible bachelor. She began telling Julian fabricated stories about my childhood, painting me as a girl who was constantly faking injuries to get out of chores. I tried to defend myself, but my sister spoke over me with a practiced ease that made my protests seem like the very dramatic outbursts she described. Julian looked uncomfortable, but he remained polite, though I could see him glancing toward my parents, who were nodding along with Jocelyn's lies from across the room. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly rowdy as the open bar took its toll, and Cassandra's behavior became more erratic and aggressive. She began a series of party games that were really just excuses to humiliate people she deemed inferior, and I knew it was only a matter of time. I tried to slip away to the balcony for fresh air, but Jocelyn blocked my path, insisting that I stay for her big announcement and the fireworks. She grabbed my arm with a grip that was far too tight, her nails digging into my skin as she whispered that I shouldn't try to steal her spotlight. I looked at Madeline for help, but my mother just smiled at a guest and pretended not to see the fear etched on my face. I realized then that I was completely alone in a room full of people trapped in a nightmare of gold leaf and marble. 8:30 p.m. arrived with a sudden hush as Cassandra gathered everyone near the massive glass sliding doors leading to the wrap-around balcony. The night air was crisp, and the lights of the city created a shimmering backdrop that seemed to satisfy my sister's craving for theatricality. She announced that we would toast to her success on the balcony, while the private fireworks display began over the Hudson River. As the guests filtered out, I noticed Jocelyn lingering near the threshold with a strange bottle in her hand, her movements quick and furtive. I didn't think much of it at the moment, assuming she was just adjusting her heels or picking up a piece of dropped jewelry. When it was my turn to step onto the glass floor, my foot suddenly lost all traction on a substance that felt like ice. Before I could even gasp, my legs flew out from under me with a violence that felt like being tackled by an invisible force. I tumbled backward, my spine colliding with the jagged edge of a steel planter box, with a sickening hollow thud that echoed in my skull. A white, hot flash of agony exploded behind my eyes, followed immediately by a terrifying, heavy silence that started at my waist and flowed down to my toes. I tried to scream, but the air had been knocked out of my lungs, leaving me gasping on the cold Manhattan glass. The fireworks began to explode in the sky, showering the balcony in red and blue light, but I only focused on the fact that I couldn't feel my legs. Jocelyn stood directly over me, her face illuminated by the pyrotechnics, as she let out a sharp, mocking laugh that made my blood run cold. She turned to the crowd and shouted that I was performing a spectacular pratfall just to ruin her big moment with my usual need for drama. Bennett marched over, his face purple with rage, and he didn't even reach down as I lay there shivering and struggling to find my voice. He growled that I needed to stand up right now and stop embarrassing him in front of his clients, or he would cut off all support. Madeline leaned down, her voice a poisonous whisper, as she told me that my jealousy of Jocelyn had finally reached a pathetic new low. I managed to choke out the words that I couldn't move, that I couldn't feel my legs, but my mother just rolled her eyes and told me to quit the theatrics. Every time I tried to shift my weight, a jolt of lightning shot up my back, while my lower body remained a terrifying, empty void. The guests were whispering and laughing, taking their cues from my parents, believing that my medical emergency was just a poorly timed piece of performance art. I looked up at the stars through the glass floor and realized with a crushing horror that my own blood were willing to let me die. The pain in my upper body was becoming unbearable, a screaming protest against the trauma while the silence below my waist grew deeper with every passing second. I felt a tear slide down my temple and onto the glass, a tiny mark of my existence in a world that had decided I no longer mattered. 15 minutes of excruciating isolation passed before a shadow fell over me that didn't belong to a member of my family. Julian, the doctor I had spoken to earlier, pushed his way through the circle of mocking guests with a look of intense concentration. He knelt beside me with a grace that suggested he had spent his life responding to crises, and his hand was firm on my shoulder. He told me to stay absolutely still and not to try and move my head, his voice becoming the only anchor I had. Julian looked up at Bennett and Madeline with a cold professional authority and told them to back away immediately because their daughter had a catastrophic spinal injury. Bennett tried to puff out his chest and told the doctor that he was overreacting to a simple slip, but Julian didn't even blink as he dialed 911. My father actually tried to grab the phone out of the doctor's hand, shouting that he wouldn't have emergency vehicles ruining the reputation of his penthouse. Julian ignored him and calmly gave the dispatcher our location, describing my symptoms of paralysis and the mechanism of my fall with chilling precision. While we waited for sirens, Julian began a series of sensory tests on my legs, his brow furrowing deeper with every negative response I gave him. He noticed a strange shimmering residue on the glass near where I had fallen, and he carefully touched it before sniffing his fingers with fury. Jocelyn tried to step away toward the apartment interior, but Julian called out to her, his voice echoing like a gavel, and told her not to move. A team of paramedics arrived shortly after, their heavy boots thumping on the glass as they carried a backboard and a neck collar toward my broken body. My mother was frantically trying to tell the guests that I had a history of fainting and that this was all just a big misunderstanding. Officer Miller, a stern man with 20 years on the force, followed the medics onto the balcony, and he immediately picked up on the tension. He watched as the paramedics worked with methodical speed to stabilize my spine, and he didn't miss the way my father was still trying to argue. Julian pulled the officer aside and pointed out the slick substance on the floor, explaining that it wasn't water, but something much more deliberate. I watched through a haze of tears as the paramedics lifted me onto the board, the movement sending a fresh wave of agony through my chest. As they wheeled me toward the elevator, I saw Officer Miller pull a small evidence bag out of his pocket and begin scraping a sample. Jocelyn's face had gone from mocking to a deathly shade of white as she realized that her joke was being treated as a crime scene. Madeline was crying now, but not for me. She was sobbing about how the flashing lights in front of the building would be on the news. I felt the cold air of the elevator as they took me down, leaving the penthouse and its hollow luxury behind for the sterile reality of a trauma center. 2 o'clock in the morning brought a different kind of silence, one filled with the hum of medical machinery and the distant squeak of nurses' shoes. I was lying in a hospital bed with my head immobilized by a rigid collar, staring at the ceiling tiles as I waited for MRI results. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the machine still echoed in my ears, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of a future I wasn't sure I wanted. Dr. Eris, a specialist with tired eyes, finally entered the room, accompanied by Officer Miller, who was carrying a clipboard and a look of grim determination. The doctor sat near my bed and explained that the impact with the planter box had caused a severe compression fracture of my T12 vertebra. He told me there was significant swelling around my spinal cord and that while surgery could stabilize the bone, My ability to walk again was a massive question mark. Officer Miller stepped forward and told me that the lab results on the substance from the balcony had come back, and it wasn't a spilled drink. It was a high-grade oil-based hair pomade that had been deliberately smeared in a thick layer right where I was expected to step. He informed me that they had found the container in the trash can inside the penthouse, and it was covered in Jocelyn's fingerprints and strands of her hair. My parents had been at the police station for 3 hours, and he said they had initially tried to claim that I had put the grease there myself. However, several guests had come forward after the party, including the bartender who had seen Jocelyn bending down near the balcony doors just before my fall. The officer told me that Jocelyn was being charged with second-degree assault, and that my parents were being investigated for obstructing an emergency medical response. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and for the first time in my life, I didn't think about the family reputation or the inheritance. I thought about the sound of my father's voice telling me to walk it off while I was lying there broken, and I told the officer that I wanted the law to take its full course. My mother burst into the hospital room 10 minutes later, her makeup smeared and her silk blouse wrinkled, but she didn't ask about my spine. She begged me to sign a statement saying it was a tragic accident so that Jocelyn wouldn't lose her event planning license. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that she was a stranger who possessed none of the humanity required to be a mother. I told her to leave the room, and that if she ever contacted me again without a lawyer, I would add a harassment charge to her list. She looked shocked, as if she couldn't believe the quiet daughter was finally fighting back, but she eventually slunk away when a security guard stepped toward her. I spent the rest of the night in the dark, feeling the weight of the hospital blankets on my chest, but nothing at all on my legs. I knew the road ahead would be filled with surgeries and physical therapy, but I also felt a strange flickering spark of freedom. The invisible chains that had bound me to their approval had been snapped by the weight of their betrayal, and for the first time I was in control. 6 months after the glass on that Manhattan balcony shattered my old life, I am sitting in a sun-drenched apartment in Boston that I paid for with my settlement. The view from my window doesn't overlook Central Park, but it shows a community of real people living real lives, and that is more than enough. I spend my mornings in a specialized gym, gritting my teeth as I move my legs through a robotic exoskeleton that helps me simulate the act of walking. It is a slow, agonizing process that leaves me drenched in sweat, but the doctors say I am making progress because of my sheer stubbornness. Jocelyn was convicted and received a period of probation, along with 500 hours of community service and a permanent criminal record that ended her career. My parents lost the penthouse and a large portion of their savings to legal fees and the civil lawsuit I filed against them to cover my medical care. Bennett's partners at the law firm forced him into an early, shameful retirement because they didn't want a man who ignored his daughter's screams associated with their brand. Madeline is reportedly living in a small condo in Jersey, no longer invited to the galas and fundraisers that were once the air she breathed. I haven't answered a single one of their letters or calls, and I have instructed my lawyer to return any packages they send to me unopened. My friend Kendra is here with me today, helping me organize my new studio space and making sure I don't overexert myself after a grueling therapy session. She doesn't treat me like a victim. She treats me like the strong, independent woman I have always been, even when I didn't believe it myself. We are planning a small party for next month to celebrate the launch of my new design firm, and for the first time, there will be no hidden agendas. I have learned the hard way that blood doesn't make a family. It just makes a biological connection that can be as toxic as any poison. True family are the people who stay by your side when you are lying on the ground, the ones who listen to your pain instead of telling you to hide it. I still have days where the anger threatens to consume me, but then I look at how far I have come, and I realize that they didn't just break my body, they broke my cage. I am no longer the girl who swallows her tears to keep the peace, and I will never again let someone else define the limits of my strength. Thank you for listening to my journey from that cold balcony to this new honest life I have built. If you have ever been made to feel like your suffering was an inconvenience to the people who were supposed to love you, I hope my story gives you courage. Your pain is real, your voice matters, and you never have to stay in a house where the walls are built out of lies. Please share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to save yourself. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can join our community of survivors and thrivers. Your support means the world to me as I continue to heal and grow, and I look forward to reading every single one of your messages. Until next time, remember that you are stronger than